Over 100,000 years ago, in what is now southern Africa, early humans carved abstract symbols into stone. Archaeologists still debate what these symbols mean. They examine them under microscopes, photograph them from every angle, publish papers arguing their interpretations. But one thing remains certain: these were not decorations. They were not idle marks made to pass an afternoon. They were meanings carved before writing existed, before scripture was conceived, before religion as we understood it today ever took form. What did the earliest humans believe was behind creation, before gods had names? Before temples rose toward the sky, before priests spoke their holy words, before sacred texts were written on papyrus or parchment or stone tablets, what did humanity believe stood at the center of existence itself? Because long before organized religion, Africa formed humanity's first idea of the divine. If you want the deeper history they never taught, subscribe to Ancient Africa Untold. Like and share this video because some stories were forgotten on purpose. Early humans did not invent gods. Not in the way we think of invention, not the way someone invents a tool or a story. Instead, they observed, they watched, they paid attention to the world around them with an intensity we can barely imagine today, because their survival depended on understanding the patterns of existence. They observed the sky, that vast dome overhead that turned from black to blue and back again with perfect regularity. They watched it for signs of weather, for the movement of stars, for the cycles of the moon. The sky was their first cathedral, their first reminder that something larger than themselves existed. They witnessed birth and death, the greatest mysteries of human existence. They saw life arrive in blood and crying, watched it depart in silence and stillness. Where did it come from? Where did it go? These were not abstract philosophical questions. They were immediate, pressing realities that demanded understanding. They saw light and darkness locked in eternal struggle, each one defeating the other, only to be defeated in turn. Day conquered night, night conquered day, over and over, without end, without variation. What force maintained this balance? What power kept the cycle turning? They noticed the cycles of nature with mathematical precision. Seasons returned. Rivers flooded and receded. Animals migrated and returned. Plants grew, died, and grew again. Nothing was random. Everything followed patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, design. In Blombos Cave, along the southern coast of what is now South Africa, archaeologists discovered geometric patterns etched into ochre. These engravings date back 75,000 years. They show deliberate design, careful planning, intentional symbolism. These are not the random scratches of bored hands. They are evidence of minds grappling with abstraction, with concepts that exist beyond the immediate and physical world. Early burial rituals across Africa reveal even more about what ancient humans believed. The dead were not simply discarded like refuse. They were not left to the elements or to scavengers. They were placed intentionally, with care, with ceremony. Sometimes they were buried with tools they had used in life. Sometimes their bodies were painted with ochre, that red earth pigment that appears again and again in African ritual. Sometimes they were positioned facing specific directions toward the rising sun or toward sacred places. This was not convenience. This was not practical disposal. This was belief expressing itself through action, through reverence, through the conviction that death was not an ending, but a transformation, a transition into something else. Religion organizes belief. It creates structures and hierarchies and priesthoods. It builds temples and writes scriptures and establishes orthodoxies. But belief begins with wonder. It begins with a human being standing under the stars, or watching the sun rise, or holding a newborn child. and feeling that existence itself is pointing towards something greater, something beyond what the eyes can see or the hands can touch. So what force did early Africans believe governed everything? What was their answer to that primordial question that has haunted humanity since the first moment of self-awareness? Africa's oldest god was not a god at all, not in the way we typically understand that word. It was not a person sitting on a throne made of clouds or gold. It was not a king in the sky who demanded worship and punished disobedience. It was not a being who walked among humans disguised as a traveler, who spoke in audible voices from burning bushes or mountaintops, who took sides in human wars and conflicts. It was a cosmological source, a creator force beyond form, something so fundamental to existence that it could not be reduced to human shape or human characteristics. It was the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Across early African cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, certain characteristics appeared again and again when people tried to describe this divine source. They used different names, spoke different languages, developed different rituals and symbols, but the core understanding remained remarkably consistent. This source was eternal. It had no beginning and would have no end. It existed outside of time, beyond the constraints that governed everything else in existence, while humans were born and died, while empires rose and fell, while mountains eroded and rivers changed course. This source remained constant, unchanging, the permanent ground beneath all temporary things. It was invisible, not because it was hiding, not because it was shy or distant, but because it transcended physical form entirely. It could not be seen because it was not a thing that existed in space. It was the condition that made space possible. It was not an object in the universe, but the source from which the universe emerged. It was beyond human behavior. This is perhaps the most radical aspect of Africa's oldest divine concept. This source was not moral or immoral in human terms. It did not play favorites. It did not reward virtue and punish vice, at least not in the direct, transactional way that many later religions would describe divine justice. It was not good or evil, it simply was. It was existence itself, the ground of being, the source from which all things flowed. And critically, this source was not worshipped daily. There were no temples built in its honor where people gathered every week. There were no sacrifices offered on its altars every morning. There were no prayers recited 5 times a day, or special feast days marked on calendars. Instead, this source was acknowledged. It was recognized. It was understood as the fundamental truth underlying everything, the answer to existence itself. But it did not demand or require constant attention. The earliest divine idea was not a ruler demanding obedience and tribute. It was reality itself, the presence that made all things possible, the source from which everything emerged and to which everything would eventually return. And remarkably, this idea appeared across Africa long before borders or empires, long before there were trade routes connecting distant peoples, long before any mechanism we can easily identify that might have spread this concept from one place to another. In West Africa, among the Yoruba people and their neighbors, there existed the concept of Olodumare, a supreme creator force. The Orishas, those active gods who involved themselves in human affairs, who controlled thunder and rivers and iron and fertility, were the ones invoked in daily worship. But behind them, above them, prior to them, stood Olodumare, the ultimate source, the beginning before beginnings, acknowledged but rarely called upon, because Olodumare was too vast, too fundamental, too far beyond human concerns to be bothered with individual prayers. along the Nile Valley, in the civilizations that would eventually produce the pyramids and temples that still astound us today. The earliest cosmologies spoke of none, the primeval ocean, the infinite potential from which everything emerged. Before Ra sailed across the sky in his solar boat, before Osiris ruled the underworld and judged the dead, before Isis worked her magic and Set brought chaos, there was none. The primordial waters, the source of all becoming. Not a god who acted, but a condition of existence from which gods themselves emerged. In southern and central Africa, among hundreds of distinct cultures speaking hundreds of distinct languages, stories spoke of a creator who formed the world and then withdrew, not out of disinterest or abandonment, but because creation was complete. The world was made. It functioned according to the patterns established at its beginning. This divine source remained present, remained the ground of all existence, but did not involve itself in daily human drama. It was acknowledged in moments of profound significance, births, deaths, initiations, times of crisis, but not pestered with constant requests for intervention. These were not copied beliefs. The timeline doesn't work for simple diffusion. The distances were too vast, the cultures too isolated from each other, the languages too different, and yet the core concept remained consistent, an eternal, formless, transcendent source from which all things emerged. These were parallel understandings of existence, different peoples facing the same fundamental questions about reality, reaching similar conclusions through their own observation and reasoning, not because they were copying each other, but because they were looking at the same cosmos, experiencing the same truths about life and death and existence. Different languages described the same mystery. The words were different, the stories were different, the rituals and symbols varied widely, but the underlying insight remained constant. Existence requires a source, and that source must be prior to existence itself, must transcend all the limitations that govern created things. If this idea was so ancient and widespread, so fundamental to how early humans understood reality, why don't we hear about it today? Why has it been relegated to obscure academic papers and specialized studies, if it appears at all in mainstream discussions of religion and spirituality? Before there were holy books, before prophets delivered divine revelation written on stone tablets or golden plates, before scripture was recorded and copied and canonized, humanity spoke in symbols. And Africa encoded its deepest theological truths through visual language and ritual practice. The sun appeared again and again in African symbolism, across cultures, across millennia, but it was not worshipped as the sun itself. It was understood as a symbol, a representation of something greater. The sun was the life giver, the source of warmth and growth, the power that made crops possible and therefore made human survival possible. Its daily journey across the sky became a symbol of life's journey, from birth in the east to death in the west. Its nightly disappearance and morning return became the promise of resurrection, of renewal, of life continuing beyond apparent death. The serpent appears in African symbolism with meanings that would be shocking to people raised in later religious traditions that cast the snake as evil incarnate. In Africa, the serpent represented renewal and transformation. It shed its skin and emerged fresh, embodying the principle of regeneration, the capacity of life to continuously renew itself. The serpent moved between earth and water, between the physical realm and the spiritual realm, representing the flow of divine energy through all levels of creation. It was wisdom, not temptation. It was transformation, not corruption. Water appeared as origin, as the primordial source from which life emerged. This was not merely metaphor or poetic language. Early humans understood through direct observation that life clustered around water sources. Drought meant death. Rain meant survival and abundance. Rivers were arteries of life flowing through the land. The ocean was vast and mysterious, covering most of the earth, hiding depths that humans could never explore. Water became the perfect symbol for that original creative force, formless yet powerful, the medium from which all things emerged. Breath, that invisible force that animated the body, became the symbol of life force itself. The moment breath entered, life began. You could hold a newborn that wasn't breathing and watch it remain lifeless, and then suddenly it would gasp and cry and become alive. The moment breath departed, life ended. A person could appear whole and uninjured, but if they stopped breathing, they died. Breath was the invisible bridge between body and spirit, the divine essence inhabiting mortal form. The presence of the source within created beings. These symbols carried theology before writing existed. They preserved complex philosophical and spiritual truths in forms that could be passed down through generations, remembered through ritual and art, experienced viscerally rather than merely understood intellectually. But because writing had not yet been invented, and when it was invented, thousands of years later, it did not replace these symbols, it supplemented them. The symbols remained powerful because they connected to something deeper than words, something experiential and immediate. Before holy books, humanity spoke in symbols, and those symbols, born in Africa where humanity itself was born, did not stay in one place. Human ideas migrate. This is one of the fundamental truths of our species. We are storytelling creatures, and stories travel. Ideas move through trade routes carried by merchants who exchange not just goods, but information, who share stories around evening fires, who bring back tales from distant lands. Ideas travel through migration as people move from one place to another, bringing their beliefs and practices with them, adapting them to new circumstances. Ideas spread through simple storytelling, as travelers share what they've learned and what they've heard, as wisdom moves from person to person, community to community, generation to generation. When we look carefully at creation concepts in Near Eastern traditions, in the mythologies and cosmologies that would eventually influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, we see echoes of ideas that first appeared in Africa thousands of years earlier. The primordial waters from which creation emerged, the creator force bringing order from chaos, the divine breath animating lifeless matter and transforming it into living beings. The serpent as a symbol of knowledge and transformation, though later reinterpreted in dramatically different ways. This is not about claiming that every religion simply copied from Africa. That would be both simplistic and historically inaccurate. This is not about establishing some kind of hierarchy where African spirituality is superior and everything else is derivative. That misses the point entirely. This is about recognizing that ideas evolve. They grow and change as they encounter new contexts. Symbolism develops over time, taking on new meanings while retaining echoes of older ones. Ancient Africans described reality the only way they could, through meaning, through symbol, through philosophical reflection on what they observed. They lacked particle accelerators and space telescopes. They could not measure the cosmic microwave background or calculate the expansion rate of the universe, but they did not lack intelligence or curiosity or the capacity for sophisticated, abstract thought. They looked at existence and asked what lay behind it, what made it possible, what sustained it moment by moment. And they concluded that there must be a source, something eternal and unchanging, that brought the temporary and changing world into being. This was not myth-making in the dismissive sense. This was philosophy, sophisticated philosophical reasoning about the nature of reality, Were they myth makers or early observers of existence? Perhaps that question presents a false choice. Perhaps myth is one way that early humans preserved and transmitted their observations about existence, their philosophical insights about reality, their deepest understanding about what it means to be alive in a mysterious and awe-inspiring cosmos. The stories were not literally true in a scientific sense. The sun is not a god driving a chariot across the sky. The earth was not formed from the body of a slain giant. But the stories encoded truths about existence that remained valid, regardless of their literal accuracy. The sun is the source of life. The earth is made from transformed matter, from the bodies of countless beings that lived and died before us. The symbolic truth persists even when the literal description changes. Why does this forgotten world matter now in our modern age? With all our technology and scientific knowledge, why should we care about what ancient Africans believed before writing was invented, before civilization as we know it existed? It matters because identity restoration matters. For people of African descent around the world, who were taught for generations that their ancestors had no sophisticated spirituality, that African religion was primitive superstition that needed to be replaced with civilized religion, from Europe or the Middle East, that meaningful spiritual and philosophical development happened elsewhere and was brought to Africa from outside. For these people, learning the truth about Africa's ancient spiritual wisdom is profoundly transformative. It changes how you see yourself in the world. It changes your understanding of where you come from. When you know that your ancestors developed sophisticated philosophical and theological insights, that they grappled with the deepest questions of existence and reached conclusions that still resonate today, that they created symbolic and ritual systems capable of preserving complex knowledge across thousands of years, you stand differently. You are not the descendant of people who needed to be saved. You are the descendant of people who understood the divine, who developed their own spiritual technologies, who contributed to humanity's collective wisdom about existence and meaning. It matters because spiritual agency matters. When you understand that your ancestral traditions contain genuine wisdom, not just quaint customs or colorful folklore, but actual philosophical and spiritual insight, you have the freedom to engage with those traditions on their own terms. You can choose to reclaim them, to study them, to practice them if that feels right. Or you can choose not to, but from a position of informed choice rather than inherited shame. It matters because Africa must be reclaimed as origin, not footnote. In the standard telling of human history, Africa appears as a place where things happened to people. Civilizations rose and fell. Colonizers came and extracted resources and enslaved people. The continent is passive, the stage where history occurs rather than the creator of history. But Africa is where humanity began, not just biologically, not just as a matter of fossils and genetic evidence, but culturally and spiritually. When you erase a people's first beliefs, you erase their place in history. You remove them from the story of human spiritual development. You make them spectators rather than creators, recipients rather than originators, footnotes rather than foundations. Reclaiming Africa's ancient spiritual wisdom is not about replacing modern religions. It is about telling the full story of human spiritual development, about recognizing that Africa's contribution to human understanding of the divine is not a sidebar or an afterthought, but a foundation, the beginning of the story, the place where humans first developed sophisticated ideas about existence and the source of existence. We end where we began, with humans asking the same fundamental questions. Where did we come from? What are we doing here? What happens after death? What is the source of existence itself? We emerge from a source we cannot fully comprehend. We are part of vast cycles of existence that preceded us and will continue after we're gone. The visible world is not all there is. If this journey changed how you see history, subscribe to Ancient Africa Untold. Like this video. Share it with people who need to hear this story, because remembering the forgotten world helps humanity remember itself. What if everything we thought we knew about the beginning of belief was incomplete? What if the story we were told left out the most important chapter, the foundation on which everything else was built? What if humanity's first idea of God is still speaking, still present, still waiting in the symbols and memories and quiet, knowing that refused to die despite centuries of suppression? The forgotten world remembers, and now so do we.